Drink beer, it's good for you. I'm empty-handed and I'm feeling blue, and I'm gonna drink till the day that I die.
Hello and welcome to my easy homebrew fermentation guide. I say easy because I will avoid jargon and words of science as much as possible and just tell it how it is in plain speaking English. The way I see it is that it's not necessary to understand how every aspect of a car works to be able to drive it, and beer brewing is much the same. However, if you would like to delve further into the science of fermentation, then I would suggest reading this excellent book. That will please anyone seeking further knowledge. There is a well-known saying in brewing that goes, "Brewers make wort, yeast makes beer." Clearly this statement stresses the importance of your yeast in making your beer. In this video I shall be giving a guide on everything you need to know to ensure your yeast is happy and your fermentation goes as planned, including methods to turn around a stuck fermentation. So let's start at the beginning and work our way through. Aside from brewing a wort meal for your yeast to feast on, the first consideration you give your yeast is actually within the boil, and this is done by adding yeast nutrients. Do this for each and every brew and your yeast will be off to a flying start. Before you introduce your yeast to its new wort home, it's important to prepare it properly so that it will be happy and thrive. Your yeast actually only needs three things, and these are food, which will give nutrition, oxygen, and a temperature that it likes. The wort and your yeast nutrients will cover this first requirement very well in terms of food and nutrition. It is equally vital that you ferment at the correct temperature. Also watch out about adding your yeast to a wort that is too high in temperature, because that can actually kill it. Stability of temperature is one key element that is also ignored by some novice home brewers, and it is one area that will greatly affect the results of your end beer. Investment in equipment like a dual-wall insulated fermentation system or a brew fridge will serve you well. Do note that fermenters that simply use neoprene covers do not fare well compared. Your yeast simply does not like much temperature change during fermentation, and its health will suffer because of that. However, certain yeast strains do require temperature change. Examples here would be Belgian or British yeast strains. When increasing temperature during fermentation, never raise more than 1 degree C per day. This is the equivalent of 33.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The best advice on a starting fermentation temperature would be at the lower end of that yeast specified temperature range. For example, Mangrove Jack's Liberty Owl yeast has a recommended temperature range of between 18 to 23 degrees C or between 64 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit. So we will start our fermentation at 18 degrees C or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Your fermentation will be cleaner at the lower end of the temperature this way, certainly during high fermentation, which is basically the first storm period that you'll see before things start to calm down. Because this is a British style of yeast though, it is suggested that you raise your temperatures towards the end of the fermentation period at 1 degree C per day until you hit 23 degrees C or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. This late raising of the temperature for British yeast is basically to make sure that the yeast will eat all of the sugar within its capacity. They just need a little helping hand. Belgian yeast, on the other hand, is generally stepped up in temperature later on to bring out fruity flavours while keeping a clean fermentation, because the lower temperatures are still used in the first stage of fermentation. Just like us, our yeast really needs oxygen, but this is just at the beginning of the fermentation for it to live long and prosper. It's also worth keeping in mind that by the end of your fermentation, oxygen will become your beer's nemesis, causing it to go bad. There are several methods of introducing oxygen into your wort. A combination of these can be used for greater effect. These are splashing your wort into your fermentation vessel, aeration using a drill and suitable attachment, using an air stone and pump, or via a pure oxygen tank. I have actually used all of these methods over the years and suggest you experiment with the results of each. The next consideration is what we call pitching rates, which basically is meaning the amount of yeast you use in a certain amount of wort. It is very wise to always consult the producer's suggestions. Many brewers actually overpitch thinking this is fine. Make it your mission to pitch just right, not over or under. Here is some information on the consequences of not pitching yeast correctly. Underpitching has the highest potential of the amount of different off flavours. It can also lead to a stuck fermentation. Overpitching can also give some off flavours, but mostly it will give a thin-bodied beer and an overly clean taste also. Things definitely to avoid. You will note that yeast comes in two different categories, both dry and liquid. These days both types can produce just as good results as each other with proper care. When using liquid yeast, then you should pretty much use a yeast starter, unless of course you're making a very small batch of beer. I would suggest the use of the website yeastcalculator.com for formulating how much you're going to need for this starter. If you've never made a yeast starter before, then I do have instructions in this in the video title that you see on your screen now. Don't worry about the title of this video, as it covers the making of a regular starter also. Dry yeast, on the other hand, doesn't actually need a starter at all. Some producers of dry yeast do recommend that you hydrate your dry yeast before using it. That doesn't require any special equipment and is also obviously an awful lot easier than making a starter. There is a huge variety of different types of yeast on the market, and they all have their own different quirks. I suggest experimenting with different varieties of different types to find strains that you prefer. It is actually impossible to be the master of all yeasts, but if you narrow down the playing field in the end, then you can be, in time, the master of your chosen strains. You will then be able to understand how each of these strains works and utilize them to the best of their natures. Do understand and acknowledge that the airlock is a very unreliable item for judging fermentation. To demonstrate this to yourself, simply get an empty fermentation vessel and put an airlock onto it. You will see at times it shows activity. This is basically down to air pressures. Enough said. There are actually two effective ways to monitor ongoing fermentation. Firstly, by taking samples and checking the gravity using a hydrometer. If you are using a fairly standard or basic fermenter, then this should be minimalized because obviously it means that you need to open up every time. But if you have a fermenter with a sampling tap that draws water above the bottom, also known as above the sediment line, then you have a free rein here. If you have the budget for it, then digital hydrometers like the Tilt are very nice gadgets to have in this regard, as they provide instant readings continuously. Ideally, there would never be problems during any fermentation, especially if all the points that are covered by this video are taken into account. Truth be told though, sometimes you can get everything right and you still have issues. This could be down to something totally out of your control though, like simply having a bad batch of yeast. I will now run through some issues and things you can do to get your fermentation back on track. Okay, so scenario 1, your yeast is not starting. Different strains of yeast have a multitude of different lag times before you will see activity after pitching them. Many of my fermentations actually start within an hour or two, or even less than that. I have quite a few that start within half an hour, but that isn't true of certain strains of yeast. Sometimes a lag time can indicate that the yeast was simply not happy. This can be from a neglect of good practices, or simply that the lag time is characteristic of that specific yeast strain. When in doubt, Google it and see what other people's experiences have been with that specific yeast. Be aware that lag time can last from anywhere between 12 to 36 hours, depending on yeast strain. You can help this along by gently rocking your fermenter back and forth and left and right. This is known as rousing the yeast. Never open your fermenter and stir. You only need to do this for a minute to see the effect. After doing this, hopefully you will see a start to fermentation within some hours. If that time elapses and you still have no change in gravity, then it could be that the yeast was a bad batch, or that it died due to being introduced to wort that was too hot. Your only option now is to introduce a new amount of yeast. For the best chance of success, the following procedure is advised. Simply make a yeast starter. Don't worry about if it's liquid or dry yeast. They both work just the same, and people that suggest otherwise really have missed the whole point. It's all yeast. Just be sure to use the same yeast strain that you started off with. Be sure to put this onto a stir plate for the best results, and let it go until you start to see activity. You can now add this starter to your beer. You should now find that everything starts off pretty fast. If you don't actually have a stir plate, then it's certainly very cheap and easy to make your own. Google making your own stir plate and you should find directions on how to do this. Okay, so on to scenario 2. Your yeast has been busy and is usually about done by now, but you are missing your suspected final gravity. The tried and tested solution here would be to actually do two things. Firstly, raise your temperature by another 1 degree C per day until you hit the maximum suggested temperature range for your yeast. Also, rouse the yeast using the rocking method that I showed in scenario 1. If this doesn't work, then consider how far away you are from your final gravity. If it's no more than 5 points, then I would simply go ahead as per normal and do kegging or bottling as you would normally do. If it's more than 5 gravity points away, then I would suggest adding more yeast via a starter on a stir plate as per the method in scenario 1. Okay, so scenario 3, weird looking things in my wort or beer. Well, this is certainly one of the most alarming things that a homebrewer can face. With any particular beer brew, the first thing you should see is Rousing, like you see on the screen here. But if that then is followed by some of these pictures that I'm going to show you now, then you know you have a problem. As you will no doubt see in the pictures that are following here, a lot of these infections look really nasty, and it's fairly obvious that you have a problem straight away. But it doesn't necessarily mean that your beer is over. Sometimes these types of beers can be saved. I've actually been very lucky, and I've actually never ever had an infection in a beer ever. But if I was to, what I would do is I would use a siphon and I would draw some wort from the bottom and see how it tastes. If it tastes okay, then chances are you'll be able to save some of your beer. But be very careful with this, and really anything that looks really nasty or has anything like mould in it or anything like this, then really do so at your own risk. Personally, I think that it's a case of just seeing it and trying it for yourself and really making a judgment call. Certainly you're going to want to leave the top few litres well alone. The thing with this problem is that it can always be avoided, and it's just a simple case of realising that the most important thing about brewing, cleanliness and sanitisation. Make sure that everything that comes into connection with your wort is always clean and sanitary. and then you will simply have no problems like this ever. So there you go, this is the end of this particular video. I hope you've all found it very useful and enjoyable. I certainly enjoy preparing it, and I look forward to all of your comments in the comments section on YouTube or on Facebook. So if you did like this video, then please do go ahead and like it on YouTube. This really helps me out and allows the videos to be seen by a wider audience on YouTube. I've got a lot of videos in the pipeline for the future, so if you're interested in seeing what I've got coming up, then please subscribe for future content. If you have any questions on anything that I've covered in this video or in others, or anything to do with brewing in general, then please do not hesitate to get in touch. I'm more than happy to help. Until then, happy brewing!